Okay. Again, what we just read here in verses 3 and 4 is clearly a description of the relatively brief but amazing reign of Alexander the Great that even the liberal critics acknowledge without argument. Of course, for them, that's the whole point. Since it's so clear, therefore, they say it must have been written after the fact. I find myself saying that a lot, but that's their constant argument. They just will not get off that point. In verse 4, where it says, "But as soon as he has arisen," the term arisen there in the Hebrew has a military connotation. As soon as indicates the surprisingly short duration of his reign. In other words, as soon as he has risen, his kingdom will be broken. Especially in the light of the nature of his kingdom, his rulership, and the power and genius of Alexander that he demonstrated. In verse 3, we read that it says he will rule with great authority and do as he pleases. And he did. So it's really kind of amazing that everything went as short as it did, and he died when he did, and it all fell apart so quickly. He reigned from the time that he conquered Persia, and which was in 334 BC until his death in 323 BC, so a period of 11 years. And was only 32 or 33 when he died. We've already discussed in some detail these things when we were examining the prophecy concerning Alexander in Daniel chapter 8, verses 6 through 8. Let me remind you of something we read at that time regarding these details following his death. Let me read this quote from Walvoord again. We read it back at the time, but it's been a while. He says, Walvoord says, "His death left a great conquest without an effective single leader, and it took about 20 years for the empire to be successfully divided. Practically all commentators, however, recognize the four horns." Again, this is a comment about Daniel 8, but I'm just reminding you of the history. "The four horns as symbolic of the four kingdoms of the Diadochi, which emerged as follows. 1. Cassander assumed rule over Macedonia and Greece. Lysimachus took control of Thrace, Bithynia, and most of Asia Minor. Seleucus took Syria and the lands to the east, including Babylonia. And Ptolemy established rule over Egypt and possibly Palestine and Arabia Petraea." Now, those last two, Seleucus over Syria and Ptolemy over Egypt, are where we pick up and where this starts to focus on the details of concern for this prophecy. Now, additionally, it says in verse 4, it says, "Though not to his own descendants, for his sovereignty will be uprooted and given to others." I've left out one phrase there in referring to that, which we'll talk about in a moment. But the idea here being that the four generals that Alexander took over Alexander's empire during those 20 years were not his sons, were not Alexander's sons. In fact, Hercules, his son at the time of his death, whose mother was Barsina, was murdered by Polysperchon. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Also, young Alexander, named after his father, who was born to Roxana after Alexander's death, he was murdered in 310 BC. So none of his sons had any part of this, hence the though not to his own descendants. For his sovereignty will be uprooted and given to others beside them. The last part of verse 4 there that I left out in the reading of that, which has got two parts saying the same thing surrounding this other statement, "nor according to his authority which he wielded." This was fulfilled in the fact that after Alexander's death, after his empire fell into the hands of his four generals, the former glory and power was not preserved. The strong central governing that had characterized his rule of his empire passed away with the death of Alexander. It was, in fact, a divided kingdom. Now, Daniel 11:5 says, "Then the king of the south will grow strong, along with one of his princes, who will gain ascendancy over him and obtain dominion. His dominion will be a great dominion indeed." This begins an allusion to the struggle between the various kings of the south, that is Egypt. He says here the king of the south, but in verse 8 is where he defines who the king of the south is. It says, "And also with their gods, their metal images, and the precious vessels of silver and gold he will take into captivity to Egypt, and he and his part will refrain from attacking the king of the north for some years." The king of the south is reference to Egypt. The king of the north, which is Syria, Syria is not specifically identified in here because Syria is not in existence by name at the time Daniel prophesied this. Egypt was, but what became the king of the north, which was Syria, didn't exist at the time that Daniel made the prophecy, so he just simply describes him as the king of the north. And of course, for the most part, the references to north and south, etc., and east and west in the scriptures are usually reference to the promised land, to Israel. North of Israel to this very day is Syria, and to the south is Egypt. Excuse me, I have to blow my nose. I'm sorry. So what he's going to begin doing here prophetically is tracing, the angel is going to begin tracing for Daniel in prophecy these various kings and the things that go on between them up until Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus the fourth Epiphanes, a period of about 150 years. And again, verse 8 identifies the king of the south as Egypt. And by the way, the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament scriptures, translates south as Egypt throughout the passage. So it was universally accepted. The king of the south, everybody knows, is Egypt. And the king of the north is in reference to Syria in this portion. Now later on, in the end of the chapter, we're going to be seeing the king of the south and the king of the north, and it's going to be more involved than merely Egypt and merely Syria. But that gets us into the end of time, where there's other powers involved in other alliances. Now, not all of the rulers are mentioned, as I said before, but usually the identification is clear to those who've studied the prophecy, even as unbelievers, and know the history. Then who these people are and who it's alluding to is clear to those people who've gone to great lengths at studying these things. So they know what the prophecy says and what history says. Then it's fairly clear to them who these things are alluding to. Regarding the historical fulfillment, let me read from Walvoord again now. It says, "The king of the south," let me read verse 5 again here, because we've made some comments and kind of maybe lost track of what we're saying here. Verse 5 says, "The king of the south will grow strong, along with one of his princes, who will gain ascendancy over him and obtain dominion. His dominion will be a great dominion indeed." Now, by the way, the king of the south and one of his princes sounds like a prince of the south. Remember that the king of the south, the Egyptian king, and the king of the north, the Syrian king, were two kings that were a part of the overall Grecian Empire. Okay, now they didn't start out as kings, but they ended up calling themselves kings. And they were interrelated with one another. They were all part of the same kingdom. So it'd be one of his fellow princes. All right? It's not a prince like the heir to the throne in Egypt in this case. This is talking about one of his fellow princes. And again, as we read further through the text, it becomes clear that we're talking about the king of the north here, who is the Syrian king. And they started out as pals, if you will, but then it says, along with one of the princes who will gain ascendancy over him and obtains dominion, they're going to start having some problems, and each one's going to want more power than he has. And so the king of the north, the prince who gains ascendancy over him, is going to get that, and his domain will be a great dominion indeed. So let me read what Walvoord says historically here. He says, the king of the south in verse 5 is probably Ptolemy the first Soter, 323 to 285 BC. The one referred to as he shall be strong above him, by the way, he didn't have the New American Standard when he wrote this book. So he's quoting out of the King James, and what's really funny is how often he says, now that should probably be rendered as, and where it's really critical, he changes it, and it's just what the New American Standard has before it was written. But in this case, this is the King James rendering. He shall be strong above him, ours is, he will gain ascendancy over him, is the king of Syria, Seleucus the first Nicator, 312 to 281 BC. These rulers took the title of king in 306 BC. Seleucus had fled from Antigonus of Babylon and was temporarily associated with Ptolemy I of Egypt. They combined their strength and defeated Antigonus, thus paving the way for Seleucus to gain control of the entire area from Asia Minor to India. And in time he became stronger than Ptolemy, who ruled in Egypt. Now he's describing the historical record here, which is what this prophecy said would happen. Hence the scripture says that Seleucus shall be strong above him, Ptolemy, and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion. Now, by the way, let's just make sure we're clear here. Seleucus's ascendancy and great dominion is qualified by the statement in verse 4 that those who took over Alexander the Great's kingdom, the four, which includes these guys, it says, nor according to his authority which he wielded. So in other words, as great as his ascendancy and great dominion was, it's not as great as Alexander's was. But it's great in relative to Ptolemy in this case. The king of the north had a greater ascendancy and greater dominion than Ptolemy, than the king of the south did. But not as great as Alexander's. Continuing with Walvoord, he says, the emergence of Ptolemy as ruler of Egypt and Seleucus as ruler of Syria, surrounding territory, laid the basis for these two lines of rulers in their respective countries, and also set up a situation where they became rivals. The king of the south was also strong, as verse 5 indicates. Again, the king of the south will grow strong. The expression, one of his princes, probably refers to Seleucus, described in the clause which follows. A possible translation is, one of his princes shall be stronger than he. Okay, so now we know who we're talking about here, is these first two rulers, Ptolemy and Seleucus, in Egypt and Syria respectively. And with the Syrian ruler, Seleucus, becoming stronger and having greater ascendancy and more dominion. Verse 6 says, and after some years they will form an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south will come to the king of the north to carry out a peaceful arrangement. But she will not retain her position of power, nor will he remain with his power. He, the daughter of the king of the south marries from the king of the north. But she will be given up along with those who brought her in, and the one who sired her, as well as he who supported her in these times. Okay, now let's look at the details of this. After several years, it says, and after some years, they're going to form this alliance with this marriage. Now, throughout history, it's been common, and you see it in old movies, and you read about it in history, about how, for political reasons, there's often intermarriage between key royal persons from two different countries, or political powers, in this case, Egypt and Syria, designed to bring about some political end. That's common. You hear about it all the time. And of course, they do these stories about the princess who's being forced to marry some prince she doesn't want any part of because she's in love with some other guy. You know, well, that's what we're talking about here, a political marriage. Walvoord, in describing this historically, says this. The participants were the king of the south, Ptolemy, Philadelphus, who reigned from 285 to 246 BC, and his daughter Berenice, who was married to Antiochus II Theos, 261 to 246 BC. And this took place approximately 252 BC. Passed over without mention is Antiochus I Soter. The marriage was consummated at the demand of Ptolemy Philadelphus, who required Antiochus to divorce his own wife, Laodicea, or Laodice, it says, or Laodice, spelled two different ways, in order to facilitate the marriage. So this was kind of a forced deal. So the Egyptian daughter is marrying somebody who's already married, and he's being forced to divorce his wife to marry the Egyptian in order to bring about this treaty. It says here, to carry out a peaceful arrangement. This is in reference to the intent of the union. The very fact that they forced the king to divorce his wife to bring this to pass wouldn't exactly make the arrangements very peaceful. But the point of it, in the reference to being a peaceful arrangement, has to do with it. Literally in the Hebrew, it's to make a straightening, and the King James says to make an agreement. So the point of this is to bring about a kind of peace between them by having the marriage between the two royal families. The rest of verse 6 indicates that the union was not successful and that nobody prospered as a result of this. With the phrase, but she will not retain her position of power, the King James is rendered, she'll not retain the power of the arm, obviously refers to her physical and political power would not be retained. That she was not going to maintain power. Sorry. This cold has just suddenly come upon me here. All of the terms that follow there in verse 6 indicate that all the others involved would also fail in their power in spite of their plan. Historically, what happened is this. Within 2 years of the marriage, Ptolemy, who arranged the thing in the first place, died. That's the one who sired her. He didn't. Okay, that's the father, her father. After the death of Ptolemy, who had forced Antiochus to divorce his wife, Laodicea, in order for him to marry Berenice, Antiochus took the opportunity then, once Ptolemy died, to take back his wife Laodicea. And you know the old expression, hell hath no fury like as a woman scorned? Proved to be true in this situation, because after he took her back, to gain revenge, she murdered her husband Antiochus, as well as the Egyptian wife, Berenice, and their infant son. So this wonderful arrangement for peace didn't bring about any peace at all. So again, the details were fulfilled in history very precisely. Daniel 11, 7 through 9. Let me read that first, then we'll comment. It says, but one of the descendants of her line will arise in his place, and he will come against their army and against the fortress of the king of the north, and he will deal with them and display great strength. And also their gods with their metal images and their precious vessels of silver and gold he will take into captivity to Egypt. And he on his part will refrain from attacking the king of the north for some years. After he does that, then he's going to not do it again for some years. Then the latter, the king of the north, will enter the realm of the king of the south and will return to his own land. Okay, let me read again Walvoord's comments on this to help out with the history. It says, subsequent to the events of verse 6, a new king of Egypt known as Ptolemy III Euergetes, who reigned from 246 to 221 BC, succeeded in prevailing militarily over the king of the north, Seleucus Callinicus, who reigned from 247 to 226 BC. And as the prophecy indicates, he entered into the fortress of the king of the north, carried into Egypt princes as hostages, some of their idols and their precious vessels of silver and gold. The expression out of a branch of her roots, literally the sprouting of her roots, signifies lineage. Now ours says simply, but one of the descendants of her line. Okay, he's dealing with the King James there. Ours just more simply says one of the descendants of her line. That doesn't mean her descendants. It means the descendants of her line of lineage above her. Now there's one of the descendants of her father. Okay, became king when her father died, and then he got some revenge of his own by attacking the king of the north and removing some of their princes and their idols and their silver and gold vessels, etc., down to Egypt. The expression "out of the branch of roots," literally sprouting of roots, signifies lineage, the immediate ancestry of Berenice, the ancestry above her. The person referred to is consequently the son of her parents, her own brother Ptolemy III Eugetes, the successor of Ptolemy Philadelphus. Okay. Also, another quote from Walvoord on this. He says, Jerome, the guy that wrote such a great commentary on Daniel, that was for 1,000 years the standard, and was a conservative and refuted that other guy I mentioned earlier. I forgot his name. Porphyry. It says, Jerome in his commentary provides the description of the conquest by Ptolemy Eugetes. Quote, he came up with a great army and advanced into the province of the king of the north, that is Seleucus Callinicus, who together with his mother Laodicea was ruling in Syria, and abused them. She's the one who bumped off, the husband and her husband who divorced her, etc. Was ruling in Syria and abused them, and not only did he seize Syria, that is the Ptolemy Eugetes, the king of the south, he abused Syria, but he also took Cilicia and the remoter regions beyond the Euphrates, and nearly all of Asia as well. And then when he heard that a rebellion was afoot in Egypt, he ravaged the kingdom of Seleucus and carried off as booty 40,000 talents of silver, and also precious vessels and images of the gods to the amount of 2,500. Among them were the same images which Cambyses had brought to Persia at the time when he conquered Egypt. So he's getting them back. The Egyptian people were indeed devoted to idolatry, for when he had brought back their gods to them after so many years, they called him Euergetes, benefactor. That's where he got the name Ptolemy Euergetes. And he himself retained possession of Syria, and he handed over Cilicia to his friend Antiochus that he might govern it. That's not Antiochus Epiphanes, that's an earlier Antiochus. That he might govern it, and the provinces beyond the Euphrates he handed over to Xanthippus, another general. So that's Jerome's historic description of what happened in those days. Excuse me. In verse 8, when it says, and also their gods with their metal images and their precious vessels of silver and gold he will take into captivity of Egypt, which we just read about, and on his part he will refrain from attacking the kingdom for some years. On this first part, in capturing their gods and their idols and taking them, the transportation of the idols of the king of the north by the king of south to Egypt indicates their total subjugation of the northern kingdom. It's a symbol. In this case, they were getting back some of their old idols, but also it's kind of a standard thing. It's a way of demonstrating your dominion over people. And it's just like Nebuchadnezzar when he took the vessels, the holy vessels, out of the temple and took them to Babylon. That's a way of subjugating the people. In Isaiah chapter 46, verses 1 and 2, Isaiah 46, 1 and 2. It says, Bel, that's pagan god, Bel is bowed down, Nebo stoops over, another one. Their images are consigned to the beasts and the cattle. The things that you carry are burdensome, a load for the weary beast. They stooped over and have bowed down together. They could not rescue the burden, but they themselves have gone into captivity. It's a prophecy of some of the these false gods being taken captive. Also in Jeremiah 48:7. Jeremiah 48:7 says, "For because of your trust in your own achievements and treasures, when you yourself will be captured," this is a prophecy against Moab, another heathen people, "even you yourself will be captured, and Chemosh will go off into exile, together with his priests and his princes." Chemosh is a pagan god. Hosea 10:5, the last one I'll refer to in this way to indicate this. Hosea 10:5, "The inhabitants of Samaria will fear for the calf of Beth Haven. Indeed, its people will mourn over it, and its idolatrous priests will cry out over it, over its glory, since it has departed from it." So this is prophetic allusions to these various gods being carried off. Is really, it's a judgment of God against them that he allows these things to take place. In commemoration of his victorious deed, Ptolemy Euergetes erected a monument that is known, I guess they've even found this thing, called Marmor Agelatanum. I don't know what that means, but that's the name of it, which boasted that he subjugated Mesopotamia, Persia, Susiana, Media, and all of the countries as far as Bactria. Ptolemy Euergetes did not attack Syria again. Nothing more happened until, in verse 9, it says, and he said, Daniel 11, I'm in the wrong chapter. Daniel 11:9 says, "And the latter," which is the king of the north, when it says he will refrain from attacking the king of the north for some years, now that's the king of the south, then it says, "Then the latter, the king of the north, will enter the realm of the king of the south, but will return to his own land." This is Seleucus Callinicus, who was defeated by Euergetes, Ptolemy Euergetes, who after several years after the Egyptian invasion was able to mount a return attack on Egypt about 240 BC, but it says, but he returned to his own land because, historically, the fact is he was defeated completely and was forced to return to Syria. Again, the prophetic details are just simply fulfilled in history. Very precisely. All of this was just the beginning of the seesaw battle between the two nations, the king of the north, the king of the south. And it's all background on the more important point of the prophecy in verses 10 through 19, which is the ascendancy of Syria over Egypt. You know, up to this point, Egypt seems to hold greater sway in the, up to this point. But this is showing the development of Syria over Egypt and the return of the Holy Land to Syrian control. And again, all of this, ultimately, the important point is its relationship to the Holy Land and to the people of Israel. This sets the stage for the persecutions of Israel under Antiochus Epiphanes, which is the major subject of verses 21 through 35 of this prophecy. Now, Daniel 11:10 through 12 says, "And his sons will mobilize and assemble a multitude." This is the sons of the king of the north. "Will mobilize and assemble a multitude of great forces, and one of them will keep on coming and overflow and pass through, that he may again wage war up to his very fortress. And the king of the south will be enraged and go forth and fight with the king of the north. Then the latter, the king of the north, will raise a great multitude, and that multitude will be given into the hand of the former. When the multitude is carried away, his heart will be lifted up, and he will cause tens of thousands to fall. Yet he will not prevail." Okay, let's read Walvoord again on the history here. It says, although Seleucus II Callinicus, was unsuccessful in his attack on Egypt, his successors, described as his sons, proved to be more successful. Seleucus III, 226 to 223 BC, came to an untimely end, having perished in battle in Asia Minor. but the task was ably carried out by Antiochus III the Great, 223 to 187 BC. That's a fairly lengthy rule, 36 years. Because of the passing of Seleucus, the plural of the first part of the verse is changed to the singular. That is, his sons will mobilize and assemble a great multitude of forces, and then it says, and one of them will keep on coming and overflow. Okay, that's kind of interesting. Even that detail is fulfilled. Antiochus the Great was able to mount several campaigns against Egypt, and largely because of the indolence of the Egyptian ruler Ptolemy Philopator from 221 to 203 BC, he restored to Syria the territory as far south as Gaza. That would be what we call the Gaza Strip today, which is part of Israel. Sorry. The approach of the armies this near Egypt proper aroused the Egyptian ruler, who assembled a large army to combat Antiochus. In verse 11 again it says, the king of the south will be enraged and go forth and fight with the king of the north. Up to that point he was indolent and wasn't doing much. Then the latter will raise a great multitude, but that multitude will be given into the hand of the former. Okay, let's see what he says here. Okay, so he assembles, the king of the north assembles a great army to combat Antiochus. In 217 BC, Antiochus met the Egyptian army at the Palestinian border at Raphia. The Egyptian army was directed by Ptolemy, accompanied by his sister wife, Arsinoe. There were about 70,000 soldiers on each side. The battle resulted in a complete victory for Egypt. And as Jerome comments, Antiochus lost his entire army and was almost captured as he fled into the desert. Excuse me. The prophecy was fulfilled that the multitude of the Syrians was given into the hand of the Egyptians. However, a peace had to be arranged because Antiochus had managed to escape. As verse 12 indicates, let's read verse 12 again. When the multitude is carried away, his heart will be lifted up, and he will cause tens of thousands to fall, yet he will not prevail. As verse 12 indicates, the Egyptian monarch was too indolent to pursue his advantage. Although the battle was disastrous for the Syrians, it tended to bring peace between the two nations, at least temporarily. Okay, now let's read verses 13 through 16. It says, for the king of the north will again raise a greater multitude than the former, and after an interval of some years, he will press on with a great army and much equipment. Now in those times many will rise up against the king of the south with violent ones among your people. Now this is your people, the Israelites. Your people, Daniel. And will also lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision, but they will fall down. So then the king of the north will come, cast up a siege mound, and capture a well-fortified city, and the forces of the south will not stand their ground, not even their choicest troops, for there will be no strength to make a stand. But he who comes against him will do as he pleases, and no one will be able to withstand him. He will also stay for a time in the beautiful land, that's Israel, with destruction in his hand. All right, let me read Walvoord again. He says, meanwhile, Antiochus III turned his attention to conquest in the east, in which he was quite successful, gathering strength and wealth. In the period 212 to 204 BC, he advanced east to the borders of India and as far as north as the Caspian. Ptolemy Philopator and his queen died mysteriously in 203 BC and were succeeded by their infant son, Ptolemy V Epiphanes. That's not Antiochus Epiphanes. Don't mix up those names. Ptolemy V, that's the Egyptian ruler, as an infant son. In 201 BC, Antiochus managed, that's the Syrian ruler, managed to assemble another great army and began a series of attacks on Egypt. Okay, commenting in verse 14, which says, now in those times many will rise up against the king of the south. The violent ones among your people will also lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision, but they will fall down. A guy by the name of Otto Zockler wrote a book called The Book of the Prophet Daniel. that was a chapter in his book called A Commentary on the Holy Scriptures, volume 13 in 1876. He described the involvement of the Jews that are now brought into this at this point in this verse. Let me read it again so you understand. Now in those times, many will rise up against the king of the south, the violent ones among your people. These are Israelites now. Who will lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision, but they will fall down. Zockler says this, the oracle, which refers to Daniel the writer, the oracle refers to the league against Egypt into which a large number of Jews entered with Antiochus the Great, and to their participation in his warlike operations against that country, against Egypt. That is, his attacks on the garrisons which the Egyptian general Scopas had left in the citadel of Jerusalem. That's why the Jews are involved at all, because this is what's going on right in Jerusalem in reference to a citadel there that was an Egyptian citadel. Zockler goes on in comments and he says, the theocratic writer, Daniel again, sternly condemns this partial revolt to the Syrians as a criminal course or as common robbery because of the many benefits conferred upon the Jewish state by the earlier Ptolemies, that is, by the Egyptians. That's comments by Zockler on that. The phrase, in order to fulfill the vision, when it says some of your people are also going to lift themselves up in order to fulfill a vision, probably refers to the coming persecutions of the Jews under Antiochus Epiphanes that were already prophesied in Daniel chapters 8 and 9, and which are going to be prophesied further here. But it was perhaps, that's what God used to set that up. So that's what probably is referred to by in order to fulfill the vision. Verses 15 and 16, which we already read, but I'll read again just so we can keep up with what we're doing here. I'm going to read Walvoord's explanation of it. It says, then the king of the north will come up, cast a siege mound, and capture a well-fortified city, and the forces of the south will not stand their ground, not even their choicest troops, for there will be no strength to make a stand. But he who comes against him will do as he pleases, and no one will be able to withstand him. He will also stay for a time in the beautiful land with destruction in his hand. Okay, Walvoord says, these troubles appropriately can be regarded as a consequence of the revolt of the Egyptians against Syria. Encouraged by the rising power of Rome, which threatened Syria, Egypt fought back. The Egyptian armies, led by Scopas, were defeated at Peneus, near the headwaters of the Jordan River. Antiochus III subsequently forced Scopas to surrender at Sidon, referred to as the most fenced cities, literally a city of fortifications, which the Seleucid king captured in 199 to 198 BC. This victory resulted in the Syrian occupation of all Palestine as far south as Gaza. The allusion to the arms of the south shall not stand is to the unsuccessful attempt by the three Egyptian leaders, Aropus, Menacles, and Damoianus, to rescue the besieged Scopas from Sidon. Then verse 17 says, and he will set his face to come with the power of his whole kingdom, bringing with him a proposal of peace, which he will put into effect. He will give him the daughter of women to ruin it, but he will not take a stand for him or be on his side. Walvoord says this regarding that. Threatened by Rome, however, Antiochus effected a diplomatic settlement with Egypt by marrying his daughter Cleopatra to the young king Ptolemy V Epiphanes in 192 BC. He was the one who got the throne as a baby. In so doing, he fulfilled the prophecy, he shall give him the daughter of women, corrupting her. But she shall not stand on his side, neither be for him. The expression corrupting her may mean to ruin the land. That is, Antiochus the Great purposed by this betrothal of his young daughter to the 7-year-old Ptolemy to ruin the former opponent and present ally. As Young states, in this stratagem, however, Antiochus fails because Cleopatra constantly sides with her husband over against her father. So historically, that's what happened. He married his daughter off, figuring that would give him an in there to ruin, the Egyptians, and yet she ended up siding with her husband, which, by the way, was appropriate. Submit to your husband. Okay, we have got a couple of minutes left, so we can get a couple of more verses in here, and then we'll stop. Verses 18 and 19 says, Then he will turn his face to the coastlands and capture many. But a commander will put a stop to his scorn against him. Moreover, he will repay him for his scorn. So he will turn his face toward the fortresses of his own land, but he will stumble and fall and be no more. Okay, Walvoord says this. Antiochus the Great begins to suffer reverses, however, as indicated in verse 18, where a commander refers to the Roman consul Lucius Scipio Asiaticus, who as Young expresses it, quote, brought about the defeat of Antiochus, unquote. The reference to the reproach offered by him, that's, let's see, our rendering is the scorn against him. Okay. The reference to the reproach offered by him, or the scorn, refers to Antiochus' scornful treatment of the Roman ambassadors at a meeting in Lysimachia, when he said contemptuously, quote, Asia did not concern them, the Romans, and he was not subject to their orders, unquote. The defeat came about in the following manner. Having successfully sustained his conquest of Egypt by defeating Scopas, Antiochus then turned his attention to the threat from the west and attempted to equal the conquests of Alexander the Great by conquering Greece. In this he was notably unsuccessful, being defeated in 191 BC at Thermopylae, north of Athens, and again in 189 BC at Magnesia on the Meander River, southeast of Ephesus, by soldiers of Rome and Pergamum under the leadership of the Roman general Scipio. So, all this fulfilled the prophecies of verses 18 and 19, and from a historical viewpoint was important in removing from Europe the control of the Asiatic governments, which then paved the way for the Roman expansion and control later. So this defeat moved the Asian influences of Syria, etc., back over there, so that the Europeans were able to be conquered and developed under Rome, which is important in terms of the other future prophetic events. Further historical detail and fulfillment of verse 19 is demonstrated by Walvoord in the following way. He says, Antiochus the Great, who could have gone down in history as one of the great conquerors of the ancient world, if he had been content to leave Greece alone, instead fulfilled the prophecy of verse 19 in that he had to return to his own land, defeated and broken. He was killed trying to plunder a temple in Elam. From the standpoint of history, Israel was important because Antiochus the Great was followed by Seleucus IV Philopator, 187 to 175 BC, who in turn was succeeded by Antiochus Epiphanes, 175 to 164 BC, the guy we're headed toward in all of this, the notorious persecutor of the Jews described in detail in Daniel 11, verses 21 through 35. All right, we're out of time. Next time we'll pick up at verse 20 there, and I don't know how far we'll get next time. We'll probably get into the end times next time, but and I hope this has not been too boring for you. I have trouble with this material myself, but it's just good to see that in spite of the boringness of some of these details of names we've never heard of, that still the fact is these precise prophecies were fulfilled precisely in history. Let's close in a word of prayer. Father, we thank you for these things you've shown us. Pray that we just come away again with such a great confidence in your word, that we just trust your word in every way, in everything we read in it. We thank you, Father, for these things and for the prophecies you've given Daniel. We thank you for the things that we're going to be seeing next week as we look further, and especially at the future events, things that may in fact take place even in our own lifetime. We thank you, Father, for these things now. We just commit the balance of the evening and our fellowship into your hands, that it be to your glory. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.